Major funding for these broadcasts has been provided by grants from New York Community Bank, Capital One Bank, Eastern Consolidated, M&T Bank, Sterling National Bank, Meridian Capital Group, Customers Bank, Aerial Property Advisors, Perfect Building Maintenance. Additional funding has been provided by AKA Hotels, Corman Communities, AmTrust Title Insurance Company, AVR Realty Company, Avison Young, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, Bank Leumi USA, Briarwood Organization, CBRE, Chase Commercial Term Lending, Chase Mortgage Lending, Citizens Bank, Cohen Equities, Colliers International NYC, Collins Building Services, Connect One Bank, CPEX Real Estate Services, Dime Community Bank, Douglaston Development, Levine Builders, Flushing Bank, Friedman LLP, Genova Burns, Handro Properties, Handler Real Estate Organization, HAP Investments, Hodges Ward Elliott Inc., Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Center at Syracuse University, Kilroy Architectural Windows, Madison Realty Capital, Matone Group, Mercantile Bank, New Banks, Newmark Grubb Knight Frank, Optimum Window Manufacturing Corp., People's United Bank, Polsonelli, Rosewood Realty Services, SJP Properties, Stonehenge Partners, TD Bank, Terra CRG, the Knackle Group at Cushman & Wakefield, Maring Goff Family Foundation, the Moynihan Group, and these friends.
Russia, Newfoundland, Massachusetts, Williams College, Harvard, Texas, New York City, Australia, England. I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm going to get involved with real estate. I'm going to learn a lot about this city. I'm going to become the co-CEO and president of the Rockefeller Group. Thanks having Dan Rashin, my guest today. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you.
So tell me about your parents and on your mother's side, because they trace back originally to the Annabelle, right?
The Arabella.
Arabella.
Yeah, it's kind of a weave that you have to make, but my mother's father, you could trace back to the Arabella. My mother's mother came from Canada. She grew up in Newfoundland on a farm and emigrated to the United States with her 6 brothers and sisters in the 1920s.
Any idea how they ended up in Massachusetts?
I have no idea.
So they end up in Massachusetts. Let's go on your father's side.
My father's side's a bit more interesting, if you will. His parents were Russian. My grandmother came from Siberia. My grandfather came from the Crimea, but they actually met in Shanghai.
When did they end up in Shanghai? At the start of the war?
The late teens. So I think just prior to the Russian Revolution is when they ended up in Shanghai.
And when did they leave Shanghai?
Would have been just toward the end of the Second World War.
And then I think when we got together, you said your grandfather ended up in Israel for a short period of time?
Yeah, they came to the United States, were here for a very short period of time, and then moved to Israel. And stayed in Israel, I believe, until my grandmother died, which was in 1955, or the year I was born.
Your grandfather worked at Tiffany's as a bookkeeper in his last job, right?
Yes.
In New York City?
Yes.
So how does your father end up in Massachusetts?
Well, he started off, as I said, in Shanghai. He went through high school and actually 1 year of college in Shanghai. Went to the American school there. He came to the United States with hopes of going to Dickinson College, and I never understood how he didn't get there, but he ended up at Swarthmore College and graduated from Swarthmore in 1949, and always wanted to be a doctor, and somehow managed to get himself into Harvard Medical School, and graduated from Harvard, was doing his internship at Mass General, where he met a 19-year-old nurse who turned out to be my mother. They got married, went to Chicago for my father's residency, and where I was born, my brother was born. And then in 1958, they moved to Massachusetts. So a long way around.
So you are about how old when you moved to Massachusetts?
I would have been 3.
So tell me about growing up in this small rural community.
Well, I most of my growing up was in Wayland, Mass, which is about 15, 20 miles due west of Boston. When I was growing up there were 3 dairy farms in town. I believe all of those dairy farms are now condominium complexes. So it was one of those towns that was too far away from Boston to commute back in the 1970s, but is now a close-in suburb. So I grew up there with my brother and sister, my parents, fairly typical suburban upbringing, went to the Wayland Public Schools, graduated from Wayland High School in 1973.
Now, you had a couple of jobs very few people would know, and there was a recent article that was written about you, but you didn't talk about your job at McDonald's. It was one of the opportunities that you had. How do you have that job?
Well, I needed a job for the summer. Wasn't able to get anything that was terribly interesting, and a friend of mine said, if you go apply at McDonald's, you can get a job. And so I went to McDonald's, I had an interview. The guy interviewing me very seriously asked, why do you want to work at McDonald's? And I said, I need money for college. And I guess that was a good enough answer, because I got hired to make fish fillet sandwiches, make shakes in the old-fashioned way.
Were you a grill man? Would we call the?
I was not.
There was a difference between a grill man and what you did.
That's exactly right. I did not have the talent to be a grill man. The one time I was on the grill, we had to throw away, I think it was 36 hamburgers.
Okay, so you were better for the fish fry.
Yes.
And the other products over there.
That's
now,
right.
during growing up, you had some other jobs?
I was a painter.
Right, you told me about that.
At the Waltham Hospital. My father got me that job. I think that was in many ways transformative. Having a job as a painter at a hospital, I realized that whatever I did, I wanted it to have some intellectual component to it. That for me to stand there and paint, it just bored me to tears. So if ever I needed a little boost, I was a pretty good student, but if ever I needed a boost, it was working at the Waltham Hospital with the painting crew.
So how do you decide to go to Williams?
Is this going to be shown to anybody?
We want the truth.
I went to Williams because I didn't get into Amherst, which is a bad thing for a Williams person to say. I wanted to go to small liberal arts. Cities scared me, and so I applied to the Williams, Amherst, Middlebury.
When you were growing up, did you have any idea that you wanted to be a lawyer?
I did not want to be a lawyer.
You wanted to be a teacher, right?
No, I thought I wanted to be some finance type guy. I ended up basically taking the LSAT because I was talked into it.
Right, which you told me that was your guidance counselor.
Yeah, at Williams. I went into the guidance office to get help for interviews, what can I do, and the woman there talked me into taking the LSAT.
Right, because she said to you this, as you said to me when we got together, if you take it today, you'll get a higher grade than you'll take it a year from now because you're in preparatory mood.
Exactly. And she also put it in such a way that are you sure that you don't want to be a lawyer? And when I was 20, 21 years old, there was nothing I was sure of. And so for me to have ruled out a career at that point was not in the cards. So I said, okay, I'll take the LSAT.
Amherst and Williams was one. How did you decide on Harvard?
Well, I took the LSAT. I did better than I expected to do. So I thought I would apply to a few law schools, and if I got in, great. If I didn't, I would go forward with the plan that I originally had, which was to interview with banks or the typical first job out of college. So I can still remember this. It was the day before the second semester of senior year started. I'd come back from the short break. I went to the mailbox. There was the acceptance letter from Harvard, and I thought, there are worse ways to go through your second semester of senior year knowing you're going to go to Harvard Law School. So that's
and the summer between your senior year and the beginning of Harvard, you were a camp counselor, right?
I was a camp counselor. It was another sort of coincidence. I thought I had a job with the Massachusetts state government, and at the last minute, I was told that I didn't. And a friend of mine was a camp counselor and said they needed camp counselors. So I ended up at Tabor Academy on Massachusetts.
Now, you go to Harvard for the first year.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you do between your first year and your second year, this summer?
Between my first year and second year, I took a job in Washington, D.C. with a small law firm.
And now the second year to the third year is that interesting summer, correct?
Yes. That year, I ended up with two jobs. I had a job. I decided that I wanted to go to San Francisco. I'd grown up in Boston and thought that I wanted to see somewhere else in the United States, make my career somewhere else, but I didn't know where. Friends of mine thought, would say that San Francisco was a great place to be. So I applied for summer jobs in San Francisco and got one. I also was told that Houston, Texas was an interesting place. I interviewed for a job down there. Got an offer, but told them that I wasn't going to be able to take the job because I'd accepted in San Francisco. And they came back and said, well, could you work for us for 3 weeks? And I said, actually, too long, given what I have to do. And they said, well, would you come down for 2 weeks? So I ended up with a 2-week summer job in Houston, followed by a 4-week summer job in San Francisco.
But that job in Houston has helped later on for your career.
It very much did, yes.
So you graduate Harvard, and then you take a clerkship.
Correct. In Washington, D.C., I clerked for a federal district judge down there, Louis Oberdorfer.
And after the clerkship, it's time to go into private practice.
That's right. And so I was looking around and thought about San Francisco's, and I worked in Seattle for part of a summer as well after my third year. But the job that intrigued me the most at that point was down in Houston, Texas. And it was a small firm that had been started by the person who recruited me at Vincent & Elkins, which is where my summer job was. But he had left to start his own firm. And so I had the opportunity to go down there and be the fifth lawyer in a litigation boutique firm.
So now the guy who really didn't know that he was going to be a lawyer is a litigator over there, and it was the first trial, right? You tried one case, and what happened?
I did. It was an oil and gas case. Well, as you know, lawyers spend a lot of their time doing a lot of things that aren't terribly interesting. Answering interrogatories, filing pleadings, making motions. So I ended up finally with my first case. I was lucky enough to be the lead lawyer on it. That's probably because we had such a small firm. I tried the case. I like to think it was at least a partial victory. But having gone through that, I realized that I really didn't like trying cases. And if that is what you're building up to and doing all of the grunt work and all of the stuff that's supposed to be boring or was boring, to then have the pinnacle be unexciting seemed to me a sign that I should be looking for a new career.
So now you go to play some basketball with some buddies in Houston?
That's right. It was after work one day, a couple friends, we went to play pickup basketball. after the basketball game, we were sitting around just having a soda, and I asked them, if they thought I could get a career in business. They'd gone to business school. They were both happened to be in real estate. And I said, can somebody who's just a lawyer, litigator, get a career in business? And both of them sort of scratched their head. I don't know, maybe, but would you consider talking to us? And us happened to be Heinz interests.
Now, they both work there? One of them was a relative of Heinz.
Well, one of them is now the CEO, Jeff Heinz. It helps to know.
So the Jeff is Jerry's son.
That's correct.
So Jeff Heinz says, would you like to meet with us?
Yes.
But what he says to you is, we have a job, but we don't have the job in Houston. We have a job in New York City.
That's right. That's right. After talking to several people in Houston, going through the interview process, and actually one point it was also pivotal, I think, in the process. I went through with an executive vice president, and he took me from the very top of a building, brand new building, all the way to the very bottom. And when we got to the end, he said to me, if your heart hasn't gone pitter-pat, going from the top of this building to the bottom, then you shouldn't be in real estate. And of course, obviously it did. But as you said, there were no jobs in Houston. This was the early 80s. Buildings were empty. And the job opportunity turned out to be here in New York City.
So it was this building called the Lipstick Building, also very well known for a tenant by the name of Bernie Madoff.
That's correct.
So you get to New York, and what is your role for Heinz at that time in New York City?
I'm working as an assistant leasing manager was my title. And the job basically...
4 years at Williams, 3 years at Harvard. You're an assistant leasing manager.
And don't forget, I was a lawyer with a big office.
That's right.
Now I'm an assistant leasing manager. That's correct.
So what do you do as an assistant leasing manager?
I was told by the head of the office that every great real estate person started by knocking on doors and trying to get tenants. So I was given a stack of brochures, and I was told to go.
But that was the time you were able to knock on doors because there wasn't security.
Very few buildings had security, and I would take my stack of brochures in a briefcase, and I'd go into a building, and the idea was to push the top floor button and then just work your way down. But I would say in 90% of the cases, there was another guy who looked just like me, dressed in a suit, and the two of us would wait and stare down, and the first person to push the button, the next guy would push the button underneath. There were a lot of guys walking through buildings trying to hand out brochures in those days.
Were you successful at that business?
I got one meeting with somebody who told me that he was bored that day and would like someone to talk to. So I wouldn't call myself a success at that part of it.
But you learned leasing because you were able, the majority of your job was Heinz had built with a partner this beautiful building, otherwise known as the Philip Johnson Lipstick Building, which is located on 53rd, 54th Street and 3rd Avenue.
Right.
It was unique because of the way the building was structured. And the leading tenant was Latham and Watkins. Who's been there over there. But you had to get other tenants.
Yeah, and I did learn an awful lot. I was not good at knocking on doors and getting tenant leads, but I was also given the opportunity to work on smaller leases, to sit through lease negotiations, to show tenants through the building.
And to learn the New York City real estate market.
Learn the New York City real estate market, although my first boss, David Lawrence, swears that after 2 months I went to him and said, okay, now it goes Park, Lexington, 3rd, right? So apparently at the beginning I didn't know that much about New York, but I did get a chance to learn.
What happens next?
Well, I worked for Heinz for 9 years in various development capacities. Worked on buildings in New York, Washington, D.C.,
right.
New Jersey.
Bristol-Myers in New Jersey.
Bristol-Myers in New Jersey, correct. I worked back and forth, went back and forth to D.C. for 6 months, working on a conversion of a post office down there for a while. And then worked on 1585 Broadway here in New York.
The property that was taken over from the Solomon family, right?
Yes, we ended up working for the bank group. And that was into 94, or actually 93. And then in 1994, I had the opportunity to go work for the Yarmouth Group.
So what was the job at the Yarmouth Group? Well, it was more in the asset management.
I started off as an office asset manager. I mean, as you remember, back then, there was no development going on at all. And a friend of mine who was at the Yarmouth Group called me up and asked if I'd be interested in talking to them. They needed an office asset manager to work on a building in Philadelphia that was in the first fund that the Yarmouth Group did. It's one of these value add funds as you were coming out of the recession. So I was hired to work on a 1600 Market Street in Philadelphia.
You stay with the Yarmouth Group, which is subsequently owned by Lend-Lease.
Owned by Lend-Lease, yeah.
And you were fortunate to end up in Australia, right?
I was very fortunate. The person who asked me to come join him at the Yarmouth Group was the COO at the time, or CEO. He came into my office and sat down and said, "What would you think about moving to Australia?" And it had never occurred to me that having a career in real estate would really be an international sort of career. But as you mentioned earlier, I do enjoy traveling around. I went to the University of Edinburgh in Scotland for a year out of college. And so the thought of getting a chance to work in Australia, to bring my family to Australia.
How was your wife's thoughts about that?
Ultimately, they were very good. But she was working full-time for Time Warner Cable as an in-house attorney, and moving to Australia meant giving up her career. So it wasn't something that she did very easily, but she was very kind to do it.
Failed. How did you meet your wife?
You mentioned that I was clerking in Washington, D.C. She was a clerk in Washington, D.C. as well, at the other end of the hallway. So we met in the courthouse.
So what year is it now that you go to Australia?
It was 1997.
So you pick up the family, you don't sell the house in Connecticut, you maintain the house, and you said to me it was really a wonderful experience, a great opportunity working in Australia.
It was. There were, for a number of reasons. Professionally, I got a chance to be the chief executive officer of a small group, or it was their investment management group in Australia. So professionally, it was a step up for me and the chance to grow. On the personal side, living in Sydney, Australia, may be the nicest place I will ever have lived when it's all said and done.
And you were an expat. So.
And I was an expat, so I lived in a house I couldn't afford, which made it even better. For my family, being in Sydney, it was still hard. Moving is hard, and moving the family is hard, and moving the children is hard. But being in Australia, where the language was familiar, where they could go to school, and the schools were fairly familiar, and fairly similar in terms of grades, it was an opportunity for them also to live outside of the United States and learn from that. And both of them have become very international, I think.
And then you went to London?
Was in London for a year and a half. Lend-Lease wanted to start an investment management business in London. So I was asked to go there to help start that up. So I was the CEO of the European Investment Management Group.
And how do you get back to Hines?
Well, I was working at Lend-Lease. I'd been there for about a year and a half. And things at Lend-Lease in the United States started to get a little rough. As you know, they ended up selling bits of their business and at the end sold a lot of it to Morgan Stanley. But the business was getting a little difficult. I was having trouble seeing how I was going to fit going back to the United States. And so I was contacted by a friend to rejoin Hines and work on the CalPERS joint venture. So that was toward the end of 2000. That was toward the end of 2000. And I decided to take that opportunity and move my family back to the U.S. at that time.
And during Hines, you have the opportunity now to go to India for a year.
Yes, I worked on the CalPERS joint venture for about 10 years and then wanted to do something different. Didn't really want to do something that different, but what Hines needed at that point was somebody to help transition their office from an expat-based office to local management. And they were going through that that time and asked if I would go over and help as their head expat was coming back to the United States. So I commuted back and forth for about a year, going 2 weeks there, 3 weeks here.
It's time to move. What happens? How do you get your first job at the Rockefeller Group, which is owned by the Mitsubishi estate?
I did the thing in India for about a year. I worked at Heinz for another 9 months or so looking for other things to do, and really couldn't find something that worked out. And so by mutual agreement, it was time to move on. So a friend, now I should mention that this friend is the same friend who called me at the Yarmouth Group and who called me to return to Heinz, but this same friend was now at the Rockefeller Group, a guy by the name of Dan McEachran. And Dan called me and said that the Rockefeller Group needed some help on a couple of projects, and could I come in and consult? So I did 2 projects for the Rockefeller Group at the end of 2012 on a consulting basis, and then at the end of that was asked if I would join full-time.
And you were involved with the urban development group at the Rockefeller Group.
Yes.
And then I believe it was about 2 years ago, you were made the co-CEO and president of the Rockefeller Group.
Yeah, about a year and a half now. It was the beginning of
Right.
2016.
And the Rockefeller Group today has what operations in America?
Well, we have offices in Southern California, in Atlanta, in New Jersey, and in New York City. And the operations are primarily development related, except for here in New York City, where, as you know, we own the 1271 Avenue of the Americas and 1221 Avenue of the Americas. But our operations outside are primarily developing industrial buildings, office buildings, and some multifamily as well.
So let's talk a little bit about family. You've been married, as you said. It was the 2 clerks that met and got married from Washington.
That's right.
You live in Connecticut, and you have 2 sons.
Yep. My older son is Stephen. He will turn 30 this year, which is a milestone as a parent to have a 30-year-old son. Stephen is currently at NYU trying to get a PhD in political science. He's 4 years into what he thinks will be about a 6-year process. My younger son, Sam, is in Boston. He did the consulting thing straight out of college for 3 years, but managed to get a job with the MBTA, the transit authority up there, after his consulting stint ended, and works for the CFO and on various projects related to that business.
So I think that, you know, your parents probably didn't expect that the Harvard graduate would be the co-CEO and president of one of the most prestigious and dynamic real estate companies in the country. And I'm happy that you've been my guest today. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much. It's been enjoyable.